This was supposed to be a simple trip. A black teenage girl, excited to visit her grandmother, who was patiently waiting at the airport gate. She had her boarding pass, her ID, and everything she needed. But suddenly, everything changed. A group of airport staff began whispering among themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction. Within minutes, a police officer was standing in front of her, asking to check her documents. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a suspect. But when her father arrived, things took an unexpected turn. Aliyah, 17, had always been an independent girl. She had traveled alone before and knew how airports worked. She followed all the rules, carried the proper documents, and always remained polite. But this time, something felt different. As she sat in the waiting area, listening to music through her headphones, she noticed a few airport staff members staring at her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just curious about something, or perhaps she was imagining things. But then, an older woman in uniform approached her. "Excuse me, young lady," the woman said, her tone firm but not particularly kind. "May I see your boarding pass and ID?" Aliyah hesitated for a moment, confused. She had already passed security, completed check-in, and was sitting at the correct gate. Why was she being asked to show her documents again? Still, she didn't want to cause any trouble, so she politely handed them over. The woman examined her documents for an unusually long time before frowning. "Wait here," she said before walking away. A few minutes later, Aliyah saw a police officer approaching. Her heart began to pound. What was going on? Officer Miller, a tall man with a stern expression, stood in front of Aliyah, crossing his arms. "We need to ask you a few questions," he said. "What is the purpose of your trip? Where are your parents?" Aliyah felt her stomach tighten. "I'm visiting my grandmother. My parents are at home," she answered calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Officer Miller glanced at her documents, then back at her. "Are you sure this is your ticket? These papers look suspicious." Aliyah's eyes widened in shock. "Of course they're mine. I checked in like everyone else. Why are you questioning me?" By now, the other passengers had started paying attention. Some watched with curiosity, while others seemed concerned. Aliyah could feel their eyes on her, making her feel small and powerless. She knew exactly why this was happening, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. She was a young black girl traveling alone, and someone had decided she didn't belong. Officer Miller raised his hand to his radio. "We need to verify these documents before allowing her to board. Please step aside." Aliyah felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "This isn't fair. I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you treating me like a criminal?" Officer Miller let out a sigh. "Young lady, just cooperate." Tears of anger welled up in Aliyah's eyes. A wave of humiliation surged through her chest like a raging tide, sweeping away every ounce of composure she had tried to hold on to. She couldn't believe she was being treated this way, like a criminal, like someone who didn't belong here. The scrutinizing gazes of the airport staff, the suspicious whispers of passengers around her, made her feel exposed, as if her very existence needed to be justified. She swallowed hard, but her hands still trembled as she clutched her passport tightly. Fake documents, had they really said that? A simple accusation, yet powerful enough to send her into panic. If she weren't her father's daughter, if she were just an ordinary person, what would happen then? Would they drag her away like a common criminal? Memories flooded her mind, her father's serious talks about protecting herself, about how the world wasn't always fair, especially to people like her. "If you ever get into trouble, call me immediately," he had once told her, his eyes somber and firm. Aliyah took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen before finally pressing the familiar contact. She didn't want to call. She didn't want to rely on anyone. But right now she had no other choice. "Dad, something's wrong," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "They're saying my documents are fake." On the other end of the line, her father's voice remained calm yet unwavering, like a rock amidst the storm brewing inside her. "Stay right where you are. I'll be there soon." Aliyah gripped her phone tightly, her feet feeling frozen against the cold airport floor. She could hear the heavy thudding of her heartbeat in her chest, the rush of blood pounding in her ears. 15 minutes. She had to stand here, endure the prying eyes and judgmental glances of those around her for 15 more minutes. Sorry for interrupting the story. Before we continue, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to us. Thank you so much. And then, just as the clock hit the mark, the automatic doors at the airport entrance slid open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He didn't need to say a word as every step radiated an undeniable authority. His face was stone cold, revealing no emotion, but his eyes swept across the room as if he had already assessed and taken control of the entire situation. At that moment, a shiver ran down Alia's spine, not from fear, but from the realization that with his mere presence, everything was about to change. Officer Miller, who had been interrogating Alia, immediately straightened upon seeing the man walk in. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I must ask you to." But before he could finish his sentence, the man pulled out a badge and held it up to Officer Miller's eye level. "I'm Samuel Brooks, Chief of Special Operations at the FBI. And the young woman you just harassed is my daughter." Silence. The air in the room turned ice cold. Officer Miller's face went pale, the usual pinkish hue draining away as if the blood had been sucked from his body. The airport staff, who had been brimming with confidence and authority just moments ago, now looked uneasy. Some took an instinctive step back, exchanging nervous glances. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some passengers started realizing what they had just witnessed. A few lifted their phones, likely recording the moment. Others simply stood frozen, mouths slightly agape. "There seems to be some misunderstanding here," Officer Miller stammered, his voice no longer carrying the firmness it once had. "We were simply following protocol." Samuel Brooks slowly raised an eyebrow. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. Just one look from him was enough to make the man in front of him feel small. "Protocol." His voice was deep and cold. "You singled out a teenage girl who did nothing wrong, questioned the legitimacy of her documents, despite them being completely valid, separated her from her belongings, and interrogated her like a criminal. Is that your protocol?" "No, that's discrimination." Officer Miller opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. A heavy silence engulfed the room. No one dared to speak. Just moments ago, Alia had been the one surrounded, her eyes filled with confusion, her body trembling under the weight of suspicion. But now the balance of power had shifted. Those who had so boldly accused her without evidence now hung their heads, their gazes unsteady, shrinking as if they wished to disappear from the situation. The airport manager arrived in a hurry, his labored breathing only adding to the tension. A formal apology was issued, but it lacked sincerity. It was merely a reluctant obligation. Some of the staff who had previously been arrogant now suddenly became overly polite, their voices unnaturally soft. They bowed their heads, forced smiles onto their faces, and even attempted to smooth things over with hollow pleasantries. But the damage had been done. No apology could erase the humiliation Alia had just endured. She stood still, silent. Her breathing was still uneven, but not out of fear anymore. It was anger. Her heart pounded not from trembling, but from the injustice tightening around her like a cold steel grip. She turned to her father, the strong man who had always protected her, and in that moment she felt two conflicting emotions, shock and pride. Shock at the harsh reality she had just witnessed, that justice was sometimes only served when power stood behind it. That if it hadn't been her today, if her father hadn't arrived in time, who would have defended someone like her? How many others had found themselves in this situation with no one to stand up for them? But at the same time, she felt pride. Pride that she had not crumbled under their contemptuous stares. Pride that she had stood her ground, refusing to be broken by baseless accusations. And more than anything, she was proud that her father had come, had defended her, and had forced those responsible for this injustice to face accountability. Alia took a deep breath. She knew she would never forget this moment, but she also knew something even more important. This was not just her story. This was a reminder that the world still had so much that needed to change. Before leaving, her father turned to Officer Miller one last time. His eyes no longer burned with anger, but held a cold, piercing sharpness, like the edge of a blade. "Next time, do your job right," he said slowly, each word cutting through the air like a chisel etching into stone. "Don't judge someone just by their appearance." With that, he placed a gentle hand on Alia's back and guided her away from the security area. They walked in silence, leaving behind the stunned airport staff and Officer Miller, who stood frozen, unable to utter a single word. The automatic doors slid open, and they disappeared from the sight of those who had just subjected Alia to such humiliation. But inside her, the feeling of triumph and strength had never been clearer. When she finally boarded the plane, Alia sank into her seat, but her heart still refused to settle. She gazed out the window, the airport lights blurring before her eyes. The anger remained, the bitterness lingered, but above all, a deeper realization took hold. She understood one thing: she shouldn't have needed a powerful father to be treated with respect. No one should ever have to endure what she had gone through today. Respect should not be a privilege reserved for the wealthy or influential. It should be a fundamental right for everyone. If she weren't the daughter of Samuel Brooks, what would have happened? If she hadn't been able to call him, who would have stood up for her? How many people had been in the same situation but had no one to help them? These questions drilled into her mind, making it impossible to forget the helplessness she had just experienced. But this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just a personal experience she could forget after a long night's sleep. This was a bigger issue, a harsh reality that many people face every single day. And what pained her the most was knowing that countless others had gone through the same thing, yet their voices went unheard, their struggles unnoticed, and no one fought for them. Alia took a deep breath, her hands clenching tightly on her lap. She refused to be just another victim. She couldn't let this pass as nothing more than a bad memory she tried to forget. If she had gone through this, if she had witnessed firsthand a drastic change in attitude the moment her father appeared, then she had a responsibility to speak up. She was determined to tell this story, not just to vent her frustration, but to show the world that injustice still existed in everyday life, to let those who had endured the same thing know that they were not alone, to make those in power rethink the way they treated others, and most importantly, to change this to ensure that no one else would have to go through what she had endured today. Alia sat up straight, took out her phone, and opened a blank notes page. She wouldn't wait. Right now, on this flight, she would start writing. Ultimately, Alia's story serves as a powerful reminder that injustice persists even in places that seem safe and ordinary. What is truly thought-provoking is not just how she was treated, but the immediate shift in attitude when power came into play. Why does a young woman need the reputation and status of her father to be treated with respect? What would have happened if she weren't the daughter of an FBI agent? How many others have found themselves in similar situations without anyone to stand up for them? This story carries a profound message. Justice should not be a privilege, it must be a fundamental right for everyone. We must build a world where no one is judged solely by their skin color, gender, or background. So what can we do today? In 2025, we have the opportunity to make a change by listening, speaking up, and refusing to turn a blind eye to the injustices around us. Teach our children, friends, and colleagues about respect and equality. Support policy changes, engage in discussions about human rights, and most importantly, be ready to take a stand when witnessing injustice. A small action today can create a significant impact in the future. And what about 5 years from now? If we persist, 2030 could be a more just world, one where no one has to fear being treated differently because of their race or background. A generation growing up with a more open mindset, a society where laws are not just words on paper but truly protect everyone. But that future is only possible if each of us, starting today, commits to taking action for a better tomorrow. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts, because every voice, no matter how small, has the power to create change. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating all individuals with dignity and respect. We firmly stand against violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.